One thing for us to remember is how unusually blessed we are in Oklahoma, in a state that has maybe 8% or so Catholic population, but we have these tremendous great hospitals in both sides of the state, the Archdiocese as well as here. And here we have, of course, St. John's and St. Francis, both of which do just tremendous good throughout the whole diocese, really, throughout there's clinics and other hospitals in other cities and all around. And the amount of, the many tens of millions of dollars of charitable care that is done by our hospitals is something for all of us to be very proud of.
Welcome back to Tulsa Time with Bishop Konderla. It's great to have you guys back. Thank you guys so much for sending us comments, sending us emails, reviewing the podcast. Those things are always great. It's great to hear from you guys on what you enjoy, future topics that you guys want us to talk about, different questions you guys may have for Bishop Konderla. Recently, Bishop, a lot of times when the diocese or Tulsa gets put into national news, it's either something really great, or
we hope.
Well, we hope, or sometimes it's not. And a lot of times the whole cheer or boo, as long as they're making noise, doesn't really work when it comes to these kind of things. But we recently got put into national spotlight with an event that happened with our hospital, St. Francis Hospital.
Yeah, I think one thing for us to remember is how unusually blessed we are in Oklahoma, in a state that has maybe 8% or so Catholic population, but we have these tremendous great hospitals in both sides of the state, the Archdiocese as well as here. And here we have, of course, St. John's and St. Francis, both of which do just tremendous good throughout the whole diocese, really, throughout there's clinics and other hospitals in other cities and all around. And the amount of, the many tens of millions of dollars of charitable care that is done by our hospitals is something for all of us to be very proud of. The dedication, the yeoman's work they did during the pandemic and that they do just all the time. So that's something for us to be tremendously proud of. What made the news recently about it had to do with the kind of a spat. I don't know if that's even the right word to use, but something that happened at St. Francis Hospital, which is that they have a candle that burns in the sanctuary chapel at the South Hospital. And that was pegged on a CMS report regarding the hospital. Now, some background there. For St. Francis and for St. John's to be able to do what they do in terms of the charitable care for the poor, they rely, as most hospitals do, on being able to be reimbursed, at least to some level, through Medicare and Medicaid. And that's what makes that kind of charitable care possible. Naturally, Medicare and Medicaid have a vested interest in making sure that hospitals that they reimburse are worthy places to reimburse, that they're good hospitals, they're offering good care for people and so forth. And so as a part of the machinery that makes that happen, there is there are various inspections that happen in hospitals regarding things like nursing, staffing, and I don't know, surgical suites and number of ER bays and whatever all the things are. And part of that has to do with safety. And in a hospital where you have people who are on oxygen and where you have oxygen available in the rooms, and for various reasons, fire can be a tremendous danger, and open flames in particular. And so naturally in their inspections, they're concerned about and also focusing on, are there open flames in the hospital? When the inspectors saw that we have this sanctuary lamp in the chapel because we have the Blessed Sacrament reserved there, they ticked that as an open flame. Well, brothers and sisters, you all have parishes. What's the sanctuary lamp circumstance in your parish? Yes, you could call it an open flame in the sense that it's a living flame, but as in the case of the hospital chapel, it's a living flame that's mounted in a brass holder that has a glass case around the flame itself because it comes as a glass bottled candle. And then that's placed in another glass case with a metal top. It can't fall off. It can't be bumped off. It's 8 foot high on the wall. You can't reach it. If you're on oxygen and you walk in the chapel, there's no danger that you're going to get near the flame. It has been inspected by the local fire marshal numerous times. They have no problem with it over all the many years and so forth. And so it was simply a matter, should have been simply a matter of the hospital explaining, this is a necessary flame. This is not a votive lamp flame in a patient's room or something.
Right.
This is a necessary flame because of what we believe about the Eucharist and how we work the recognition of the presence of the Blessed Sacrament in our chapels and so forth. And so we need an accommodation here. The hospital asked for that and was turned down. There's something called the Joint Commission, and I'm not real clear on how all these things interact, but the hospital asked for the accommodation from someone up the chain, was turned down. The hospital tried to explain further up the chain and so forth, and it just wasn't getting anywhere. And it was starting to come towards a deadline where this needed to be either snuffed out or the accommodation granted in order for the hospital to continue to be able to treat these patients. So the hospital ended up having to engage a law firm, Beckett Law Firm, which often represents people caught in what we generally would call, I guess, religious freedom cases. To send in a letter, the kind of letter that a law firm sends, do this or else.
Right, decent, yeah.
And then that quickly and immediately brought about an accommodation. Okay, so that's a big, long explanation. So then the final piece. Everything that gets picked up by the news these days.
Right.
It seems like everything that gets picked up gets pigeonholed into this and that. Okay, it's this kind of a fight. Okay, let's pitch it in that hole. And
sure.
And often things get blown out of proportion. Either the news story can be very benign, but then people's reaction to the news story creates a whole other news story.
Fuels it, yeah.
Right, and so, okay, so what about all that? In my mind, in one sense, it was a small issue. Should have been a small issue from the beginning, but in terms of that, it was kind of a small issue. But what it relates to is something that I have seen and experienced as a member of the Religious Liberty Committee at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and also as a member of the Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth Committee. I saw this also when I was chairing the Defense of Marriage Committee. I'm sorry, the Defense of Marriage and the Dark Arts Committee. That's what I always called it. But the issue of concern is the nature and the tendency of bureaucracies, and of course our government is a very giant bureaucracy. The nature and the tendency of bureaucracies to be inflexible and to have a kind of a from on high, we're going to tell you this down below sort of thing. The Catechism, talking about the political systems and the duty of Catholics to affect political systems, one of the principles in all of that is a principle called subsidiarity, which says that the lowest level of a item that needs to be worked out between people, the people who are closest to the problem ought to be the ones who work on the problem. And this is an example of why. Because the accommodation was rapidly granted because it's a perfectly safe candle. It's a perfectly just issue. And once the people at a high enough level of authority within the system saw that, they, I'm sure, immediately were saying to themselves, what's the big deal here? Just let them do that. But the people lower than that were probably thinking, no, it goes against this rule. It's clearly written, and therefore it has to be changed.
Sure.
Okay, so we were thinking, what could we talk about with this? And we're about to come into June. July 4th will be a month behind. One of the things that we tend to talk about and focus on for July 4th is this whole issue of faithful citizenship. To remind one another outside of the political campaign season, even though now it seems like we're in
a never-ending, a perpetual
political campaign season, but to try to find a time and a place away from the actual elections to remind ourselves and to even study for ourselves, to read and to educate ourselves about what is our duty as a citizen and as a Catholic, because they're somewhat different from one another. And so I wanted to recommend to people once again the bishop's website. If you were to search just in your Google search or whatever, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, you could probably get away with just putting Forming Consciences. It might even pull it up. USCCB or Catholic Bishops Forming Consciences or something. But the website of the USCCB has a tremendously rich resource for helping people understand how do we form our conscience and how do we act as faithful citizens. I think that there's a uniform dissatisfaction, even though the country is really, really divided and deeply divided by political parties, and now even by ideological positions. I think there's a common experience on both sides and every side of, gosh, we're not doing this very well.
Right. That's true. Yes.
I mean, we treat each other like, we treat the different sides like enemies, as opposed to fellow citizens who have different points of view and who are trying to reach compromises and so forth. We don't seem to have much of that anymore. And so,
public discourse is just not a thing any longer. It used to be even like people like G.K. Chesterton, and these people used to have friends who have completely opposing views than they do in almost every sense, right? I know G.K. Chesterton had a good friend that was like different in political, different in belief, different in like basically every worldview, but he was a good friend of his. And it was, and like that idea is has been lost, I think. And it's okay to have disagreeing opinions, but as Christians, we're called to love one another, right? And so,
and I that's an example. I would be willing to bet that there still are on Capitol Hill, there still are lots of examples of people on different sides of the aisle who are friends and who do try to work together on things, but we don't hear about it.
Sure.
Because the media tends to focus on the division and so forth. One of the things on the website here is something called Civilize It, civilizeit.org.
Okay.
And so this is one of the initiatives. It's a campaign inviting Catholics to model civility and love for neighbor throughout the year. Civilize It, dignity beyond the debate. Will ask Catholics to pledge civility, clarity, and compassion in their families, communities, and parishes, and call on others to do so as well. Mm-hmm. So it's noting that. Mm-hmm. If we see a really intense debate, let's say online, we can choose how we're going to react about that or talk about that. Mm-hmm. We can heighten it. We can try to spiral it up even bigger with our comments and our snarky
right. That's true.
things. Or we can say, okay, here's two sides that are sort of at each other's throats. What can I do to try to lower the temperature of that debate, that kind of thing? Yeah. In the Catechism, I was also going to read this just so that we see what the Catechism talks about in terms of our duties. In paragraph 899, the initiative of lay Christians is necessary, especially when the matter involves discovering or inventing the means for permeating social, political, and economic realities with the demands of Christian doctrine and life. So it's simply noting that we don't come to our political system as Catholics, we don't come to it as a blank slate. Mm-hmm. We're supposed to be disciples first and foremost above everything else, mm-hmm. which means that we want to take the demands of the gospel of Jesus Christ and we want to see what can we do to help our political systems use and benefit from the demands of the gospel. How can we move our political systems in those directions? Mm-hmm. So if my party, the party that I mostly align with, let's say, has this or that initiative that aligns well with the gospel, that's great.
Right.
Let's try to promote that. But I also have to note, where does my party or ideology not align with the gospel, and be honest and say, I can't support that. Mm-hmm. Even though I identify with that party, I can't support that stance of that party or that politician and so forth. Mm-hmm. There's a quote here from a discourse of Pius XII that was then quoted by John Paul II. Lay believers are in the front line of church life. For them, the church is the animating principle of human society. This is all the way back to Pius XII, mm-hmm. Second World War. Therefore, they in particular ought to have an ever clearer consciousness, not only of belonging to the church, but of being the church. That is to say, the community of the faithful on earth under the leadership of the Pope, the common head, and of the bishops in communion with him. They are together the church, and they ought to be, as the church, trying to affect the political circumstances of their day. This other paragraph 900 comes mostly from Lumen Gentium of the Second Vatican Council. Mm-hmm. Since, like all the faithful, lay Christians are entrusted by God with the apostolate by virtue of their baptism and confirmation, they have the right and duty, individually or grouped in associations, to work so that the divine message of salvation may be known and accepted by all men throughout the earth. This duty is the more pressing when it is only through them that men can hear the gospel and know Christ. Their activity in ecclesial communities is so necessary that for the most part the apostolate of the pastors cannot be fully effective without it. So That's all the more true because the pastors are not charged in their pastoral office with being the ones in the world working out these kinds of issues. It's precisely the laity who are in the world who are charged as a function of being in the world to be working towards these the integration of the faith in our political action. So this website that we have on the USCCB page has a tremendous wealth of resources, everything from bulletin inserts to teaching documents to short videos. And so I want to really recommend to people as we go through the summer and as we, move towards July 4th, that as Catholics, we take some time to look through the website on the USCCB webpage on how do we become better citizens, precisely as Catholics.
Yeah, and because we're Catholics, we have a duty to kind of uphold like how we present our the gospel like in a loving way, right? I loved how you said when we were talking about how online you can be very divisive with one another, right? And we got to remember that because because we are Catholics, we could be the only Bible, so to speak, that some people read for the day. We could be the only connection to Christ that they encounter. And so how we portray ourselves is a reflection on like how they view how the church or how a Christian is supposed to behave.
Sure.
And I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And so I just think that there's prudence that needs to be involved when we're online, especially. Like you can disagree with one another, right? But I always use this rule in my mind that whatever I write online, if it was read to my mom or if it was read to my bishop, would I be embarrassed or not?
Yeah. There's the what the content. Take, for example, an issue that we've been talking about recently in the state, the death penalty. We would like to see a world in which the death penalty is not used, except for those cases that are talked about in the Catechism, for example, where, maybe you have a country whose government is just falling apart, and the only way for citizens to protect themselves is to make sure that the person who's committing murder in the community is in fact killed. Okay, but that's not most of the world. For the most part, we have adequate penal systems that can put a person behind bars who's a danger to the community, even for the whole of their life. So we would like to see that. That's a content that we can stand behind and be very direct about. But how are we direct? It doesn't mean that the person who's against us on that issue is a bad person.
Right.
Though they may be, we may be too.
Right.
Sure. People on our side of an issue may be bad people. That's not the point. The point is, can we approach the conversation in a way that builds things up rather than tears things down? So that's what we're shooting for.
That's right. Yeah, and that takes discipline. I mean, and a lot of times that takes making sure, even if you want to say something, maybe it's more prudent to step away. Put your phone down for a little while. Go outside. Get settle the emotions.
Yes.
before just like firing something off really quick.
Well, and the other piece of it, and this applies more broadly than just this particular topic. Written communication of any kind is the least communicative, right? We, as the kind of beings that we are, we get so much of our communication from what we see. So that's why body language is so important, and a person's demeanor and so forth. And if all you've got is the written page, boy, I don't know how many times I've written an email to someone. I didn't mean anything by it.
Right.
And the way they took it, just was completely different than what I was trying to communicate. So we have to recognize that limitation of written communication.
Mm-hmm.
And thus we have to work harder at trying to overcome that by being very sort of soft in a way with what we're trying to say. Otherwise, people may certainly take it the wrong way.
That's right. Yeah. Well, so I think a good takeaway is that over the summertime and as we approach the 4th of July, you know, to go onto the USCCB website that has, you know, like you said, a wealth of knowledge and be able to form our consciences so to where we're not like cramming, so to speak, for like we do with you know, in high school. Not I've heard students do this. I never did this, but you know, cramming for tests right beforehand.
No. Now they just go to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Right. No more cramming.
Yeah.
Part of what makes me think of all this is what's already happening just as the candidates begin to line up for the next election cycle. And already, you know,
it's already, starting to go back and forth.
And so at a certain point, that just causes people to tune out of the whole thing. But that's not healthy for our system of government either. One other little thing that I wanted to recommend to people, I came across it again recently. I have a middle sister who's facing a cancer surgery. And so early in June, she's going to be facing this cancer surgery. So we're in an intense mode of prayer for my sister.
Mm-hmm.
And I came across again this little devotion called the Surrender Novena. And I recommend it to people. You can find it online as well. The Surrender Novena. The prayers in it are wonderful little meditations that help us to really move through our day if we're facing something heavy.
Mm-hmm.
How can I find a way to give this thing that I'm facing that's heavy to the Lord in such a way that I can get through my day and not just be overwhelmed by it? And the meditations written in the Surrender Novena are very helpful for that, to be able to pray this prayer that's written in such a way that it really focuses my mind on, yes, I'm going to give this to Jesus, and then I'm going to go through my day and trust that he's going to take care of it.
Because he will.
Because he will, yeah.
That's right. Because Jesus is Lord.
Jesus is Lord.
Awesome. Hey, Bishop, that was a lot of fun. Next week, let's see, what are we going to talk about next week? Are we talking about fatherhood, maybe?
We can. It's coming up. Father's Day is coming up.
Yeah, so we have a whole host of different things that we want to talk about. But if there's something in particular that you'd like us to talk about, reach out to us on our Facebook page or leave us a review on the podcast. But until then, we'll see you guys next week.